Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a seriously fascinating, deeply layered framework from our source material. We're looking at societal continuity, moral judgment, and the ethics of survival. It's a pretty dense topic, right? But the text uses this incredibly accessible visual motif to break it down. A tree, root, branch, fruit, and seed. And whether we're talking about ancient history, biology, or even modern parenting, this tree structure completely changes how we view the survival and collapse of human societies. Let's get right into it. Here is our roadmap for today. 1. Defining the root. 2. The biology of order. 3. The infrastructure of mercy. 4. The omniscience of divine judgment. And finally, 5. The curse of consuming tomorrow. Section 1. Defining the root. The etymology of genocide. So, to understand this whole argument, we absolutely have to start at the root. Why? Because the root supports the branch, not the other way around. Let's think about the word itself. Genos. It refers to a kind, a stock, a tribe, a birth body, or generative continuity. And side? That means cutting down, killing, destroying. So, at its absolute foundational level, genocide literally means the destruction of a generative body. Now sure, a modern legal definition might narrow that down for a courtroom, but it doesn't erase this root meaning that made the word exist in the first place.
But obviously, that root definition doesn't automatically answer the moral question for us, does it? It just identifies the action. So the text poses this incredibly crucial question: what kind of genos is actually being destroyed? Like, is the target an innocent bloodline, children, or a specific ethnicity? Or, on the flip side, is it a guilty corporate death order, a violent regime, or an empire of child sacrifice that actively reproduces death? The morality of the destruction entirely depends on the nature of that generative body.
Moving on to Section 2, the biology of order, the cancer analogy.
To explain this, the source introduces a really powerful biological analogy. Let's look at a cancer cell. It's not some alien invader. It's actually human cellular life that's just gone off track. It has its own immature trajectory. It wants to survive, replicate, grow. But compare that to the whole human body, which is a larger life order with governed integrity. The local life order, the cancer, has become disordered against the larger organism. You see, the part has its own trajectory, sure, but the body requires integrity to survive. You wouldn't ask a baby cancer cell to promise it won't be cancer later. We don't judge its danger by its current immaturity. We judge it by the malignant generative order it reproduces.
But here is the absolutely crucial point. Yes, immature continuity can be dangerous if it's tied to a malignant system, but the text is super careful here. We cannot flatten this analogy into dehumanizing people. Humans are not literally just cells. A human child is not morally identical to the military or political order they happen to be born into. Why? Because kids can be taught, they can be adopted, integrated, and brought into a completely different covenant order. So, while biology proves that destructive continuity is a real thing, it definitely doesn't give humans a blank check for extermination. Let's move to Section 3, the infrastructure of mercy, ancient versus modern.
Modern folks often look backward and falsely judge ancient societies by projecting our modern assumptions onto ancient wars. Back in the ancient world, infrastructure for communication and integration was incredibly rare, fragile, and hyperlocal. They had to rely on things like treaties, hostages, or household adoption. But today, we have massive, stable, rights-based infrastructure. We're talking mass schooling, international courts, digital records, dedicated social services. If an ancient society conquered a hostile group, just sparing their elites or children wasn't automatically safe mercy. Without our modern systems to de-radicalize and integrate them, that mercy could literally become a Trojan horse, allowing the defeated genos to regenerate right inside the victor's own walls.
The text sums this dynamic up perfectly. Input is not integration. Permission is not capacity. In that ancient context, sparing a hostile group without the vast structural systems needed to actually absorb them wasn't true mercy at all. It was basically an invitation for the threat to come back. The receiving body has to be able to metabolize what enters it, otherwise it just gets overthrown from the inside. And the author applies this exact same metabolism principle impartially to modern immigration, which is a truly fascinating parallel. We usually hyper-focus on legal status, right? Like, was entry permitted by law? But the deeper issue here is integration capacity. Regardless of legality, the systemic question is this: can the schools, the courts, housing, and the labor markets actually absorb the inflow at that speed and volume? The text makes the case that this isn't about some hatred of strangers. It's about whether a body politic functionally has the capacity to metabolize what enters it without totally dissolving its own civic order.
This brings us to Section 4, the omniscience of divine judgment, philosophy and theology.
Now, the text makes a very specific claim when it comes to biblical destruction, like the flood or the judgment of Sodom. It says this destruction is righteous solely because it is framed strictly as God's judicial act. And why is that? Because God alone can judge the whole tree without lying about the seed. Only God has perfect omniscience. Only God has absolute knowledge of a corporate death order's root, its branch, its fruit, its guilt, and exactly where it's heading in the future. God alone knows if a corporate order can be healed or if it literally must be completely cut off. And this brilliantly illustrates the moral boundary of the entire framework. We humans, we don't have that omniscience. We can't see the future of the seed. Therefore, if a human tries to imitate that total divine judgment, inventing extermination theology to justify racism, nationalism, conquest, or revenge, it is absolutely condemned. The text powerfully calls that, quote, murder-wearing stolen theology.
Finally, Section 5, the curse of consuming tomorrow, application. There are these terrifying biblical curses that talk about parents eating their own children during times of total collapse. The source argues that God isn't commanding this, but rather warning of a covenant collapse so severe that a society is essentially handed over to the fruit of its own death order. The literal horror of eating flesh is actually the visual endpoint of a society that has already spiritually, politically, and morally devoured its own children. The physical act? That's just the final manifestation of a spiritual crime that's been happening for a long, long time. Because as the text points out, there's way more than one way to devour a child. A parent, or a whole society, can consume their future. Children can be sacrificed to political ideology, status, or convenience. You can devour a child by making them carry your own unfinished life, your shame, or your anxiety. You can even devour them through something as totally common as helicopter parenting. That's when protection turns into possession, and a parent basically eats a child's agency before adulthood even has a chance to grow. Notice the stark contrast the text draws here. In a righteous, generative order, children are protected. The mother feeds the child from herself, nourishing life. But in a judged, collapsing order, we see an inverted genos. Instead of giving life, the parent takes life from the child. Nurture literally becomes appetite. Love becomes possession. The present just completely eats the future. Which brings us to the ultimate summary of this entire layered framework of justice, capacity, and preserving life. Quote, the sin is not destroying a death system. The sin is falsely calling innocent life poison. Look, destroying actual poison is necessary, but pretending that poison can't regenerate is just childish. And the higher our modern capacity to separate innocent people from hostile systems becomes, the greater our absolute obligation to do exactly that.
If a people won't stop devouring its children invisibly, judgment might eventually reveal that horror visibly. And it forces us to ask a really hard question. In our constant rush for comfort, ideology, and control, is our modern society invisibly devouring its own children right now? The future was already being eaten before the mouth ever touched the body. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I highly encourage you to reflect on that question and dive into the source material yourself. Catch you next time.